Hello, I'm Christopher Badger.
And I'm Mark Davis.
We're barristers at Six Pump Court and would like to welcome you back to the Environment Law News podcast, brought to you in association with LexisNexis.
Thanks, Chris. In this podcast, we'll be looking at the Office for Environmental Protection's consultation on its strategy and enforcement policy, the Spring Statement, and green claims in advertising.
First up, the OEP and its strategy and enforcement policy consultation.
Yes, this is the OEP's consultation on its draft strategy and enforcement policy, which closed on the 22nd of March this year. Now, despite the fact that you may have missed the boat to respond, I do think that it's still worth highlighting it, because how the OEP enforces is going to be so important in the years to come.
I agree. The OEP did explain that the draft of its strategy and enforcement policy had been shaped by the views of a broad range of stakeholders, with whom it had engaged in the months leading up to the consultation, including environmental organisations, government departments, arm's-length bodies and other public authorities, as well as business and industry groups. What was sought in the consultation was feedback from all on the approaches it has developed. The OEP proposes to publish a summary of responses alongside its final strategy and enforcement policy, expected in spring 2022, so pretty shortly.
It is pleasing to see that they're taking it forward at pace, given the current lacuna in enforcement. Now, we would be interested to hear any feedback that others may have on the draft, but here are a few of the areas that we picked up as perhaps needing some attention.
The draft identifies that the use of enforcement functions should be to achieve the OEP's principal objective, namely environmental protection and the improvement of the natural environment. But the policy then goes on to state that enforcement should aim to achieve environmental outcomes. That may be well-meaning shorthand, but the objective should almost certainly be made more explicit.
Quite. And in fact, I would say there is an argument for further provision to be made for the circumstances where it is necessary to go straight to robust enforcement action. After all, if you give people an inch and all.
And another more technical aspect, the draft strategy doesn't set out what the public interest factors are that would govern a decision to disclose information provided to the OEP during the course of an investigation.
And finally, there is a somewhat surprising absence of any reference to the role that environmental principles should play, indeed if any, in enforcement decisions. And there is no mention of the regulator's code and how this might apply to the OEP.
It will be interesting to see which, if any, of these issues are addressed when the finalised strategy is published shortly. In addition, questions may also be raised as to the OEP's resources to carry out its functions. The current draft provides for circumstances where the OEP doesn't have the capacity or capability to deliver. It is not evident that any other entity would be able to take action in those circumstances, and this may be a strong argument for further resources, so as to ensure that the OEP will not be put in that position, and so that there is never a situation where a decision to take enforcement action would otherwise have been taken.
The consultation came amid some important context and background given at the start of this year, with Dame Glenys Stacey speaking about the OEP, including its independence and enforcement, and Sir James Bevan, who spoke at a Westminster Energy, Environment and Transport Forum conference on future environmental standards and how to regulate better after Brexit, namely speaking softly and carrying a bigger stick. Now, both of those speeches are actually available to find online if you just tap them into Google.
And all of this came after the Environment Agency reportedly told staff to ignore reports of low-impact pollution events due to a lack of available funds for investigation.
Wow. Well, sticking at the high level for a moment or two, we'll move on to the Spring Statement. So tell me, Chris, what's the Chancellor got in store for the environment?
Well, frankly, this wasn't a Spring Statement for the environment. It was framed as action to help households and others from the rising cost of energy and goods, particularly in circumstances where the long-term effects of Putin's invasion of Ukraine are unclear. Consequently, under the heading of helping households, for a 5-year period starting from April 2022, installations of what's known as energy-saving materials, or ESMs, such as solar panels, heating pumps and roof insulation, will benefit from 0% VAT. It's suggested that a typical family having rooftop solar panels installed will save more than £1,000 in total in installation, and then £300 annually on their energy bills. Of course, you have to have the spare cash in the first place to be able to afford the installation.
Yes, and builders taking advantage of Brexit, wind and water turbines will be added to the list of eligible energy-saving materials following a domestic reversal of a European Court of Justice ruling that restricted VAT relief for such installations. And this is in addition to business rate exemptions. Now, these were previously announced during the autumn budget 2021, which have been brought forward for certain plant and machinery used in on-site renewable energy generation and storage, as well as eligible low-carbon heat networks with their own rates bill. And this is coming forward from April 2023 to April 2022.
And the Chancellor also trailed ahead to the autumn budget with a suggestion that there will be reform of research and development tax credits.
So what impact has the war in Ukraine had, do you think, Chris?
Well, the invasion of Ukraine has brought energy security to the forefront of the debate on green energy. It appears inevitable that, even if there's a long-term desire to promote renewables such as wind and solar as part of the UK's energy security policy, in the short term, it isn't physically possible to switch away from fossil fuels. It's likely that fossil fuel production will have to increase, notably in the North Sea, and we will return to a consideration of fracking.
Surely damaging our environmental ambition in the short term.
Yes, and it also raises a tension between the possibility of a windfall tax on oil giants making massive profits from high commodity prices, which could be used to pay for environmental improvements and energy-saving measures, or, alternatively, allowing those giants to use that money to invest in green technology and green energy production. And this tension fits into the debate over corporate governance, begging the question, is it now time to align concepts such as materiality and the success of an organisation directly to that organisation's ability to contribute to environmental goals and achieving net zero?
Very, very good question, but one that we won't answer now. We'll move on to our slightly lighter third story, the trials and tribulations of oats and the dangers of green claims in advertising.
As the old adage goes, there's no such thing as bad publicity. But what about when the bad publicity is about your bad publicity?
Yes, this is of course about Oatly Oats and the recent rap on the knuckles they received from the Advertising Standard Agency for what our colleague in Chambers, Charles Morgan, has perhaps not unfairly called a modest bit of green virtue signalling in adverts in the press, TV, Facebook and Twitter.
Oatly's error? Remarks that you might think of as innocent or pithy remarks in adverts, such as, need help talking to dad about milk, which led to 5 heads of complaints to the Advertising Standards Authority, 4 of which were upheld.
Indeed. And what's interesting is that the 8-page ruling from the ASA makes reference to a number of publications. The first, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations report, Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock, a global assessment of emissions and mitigation opportunities. Secondly, the UK Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report from 2014. Thirdly, an extract from a meta-analysis by Joseph Poore, a climate expert, published in Science magazine. Fourthly, a report from the Institute of Climate, or for Climate Economics, Food Policies and Climate, a literature review. And finally, the 2019 UK Greenhouse Gas Emissions Final Figures Report, published by Bayes.
Isn't that all a bit much for such pithy claims, Mark?
Well, against all of that evidence, Oatly Oats had in fact commissioned an independent product lifecycle assessment expert before making their claims. So to some extent, I do wonder whether the company is feeling rather hard done by. The question is begged, are companies to be expected to review those 5 publications or indeed other weighty scientific publications each time they're considering making an environmental claim?
I think the potential for what might be thought of as greenwashing is plainly something that all businesses are going to need to be more aware of going forwards, particularly following the Competition and Market Authority's Green Claims Code, published in September of last year. The CMA's website has a handy checklist for such claims.
Yes, I suspect it's inevitable that we'll see more and more action by the ASA in this regard. And indeed, hot on the heels of Oatly's ad being canned, Innocent Drinks was also admonished by the ASA for making what was determined to be a misleading claim in an advert that people should get fixing up the planet by buying innocent drinks, the ASA said that this implied that buying innocent drinks would have a positive environmental impact, whilst the company argued that its advert was highlighting the need for collective action.
Advertising and green claims, clearly one to watch. Thank you for tuning in for this Environment Law News podcast. For more information on any of these stories, or if you would like to discuss any of the topics raised in more detail, please contact Six Pump Court on 007 797 8400, asking for either Christopher Badger or Mark Davies, or contact our colleagues at LexisNexis in the PSL Environment team.